Excelsior! And welcome everyone. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Stan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we're going to be doing a slightly different video. One that is kind of about a topic we haven't done in a while. If you're listening to this on the Sci-Fi Corner, that is. And if you're listening to this on Storyfire, hello, we haven't done this yet here. And if you're over on the Sci-Fi Corner, seriously, go move over to Storyfire. It's a much better platform. And we like it there. Anyways, this is going to be a controversial topic, and it's going to be pretty interesting one, I think. In this one, we're going to challenge the very foundation and concept of the Marvel Universe as most understand it. If you can read, you doubtlessly already know that the topic is going to be about how Mary Jane Parker is the center of the Marvel Universe, and that the entirety of Marvel revolves around her. Yes, her. Not Spider-Man. Not whoever that schmuck is. Colonel, Corporal, whatever. Something America. Actually, he is insignificant in the grand scheme of things in Marvel. He never was very significant beyond his 40s comics from the Golden Age.
And even then, he wasn't the big hero.
That, yeah, people want him to be. Iron Man was never all that significant. I am an Iron Man fanboy, and I'm like he was ever that significant. Iron Man is about as significant to Marvel back in the day as Flash was. No, wait, Flash was perhaps more important. But this is not going to be about us bashing these heroes, but rather highlighting the nature of Marvel. Now, let's go back to the 1960s. So, in the 60s, Stan was the man and was kicking DC's rear all over the place because he was writing admittedly better stories than them. They were writing trash. It's called the Silver Age. It was nothing but trash in terms of DC. And the thing is, Spider-Man was the supposed crown jewel, but there was starting to be a stumbling block because, Peter wasn't. There was a limit to what you could do with him, and the love interests hadn't quite stuck. Now, Peter Parker himself is a very good character. He's very complex. Well, goes without saying. But the problem is, there was a wall hit. And you needed, like all characters in fiction, you need a colorful, great support cast to help him break through that wall. And the character was introduced. Now, before then, Flash Thompson was a great support character, but that was it. The rest of Spider-Man's cast of support characters ranged from needless, Gwen Stacy, Betty Brant, to funny but little more than a meme, J. Jonah Jameson, and even to an extent later on, Glory Grant, to likable but not much you can do with them, Robertson, and then to destined to be one day villainous, again Gwen Stacy, and of course Harry Osborn. Now, I mentioned Gwen Stacy because from the start she was a bipolar maniac in the original runs. She was nuttier than a fruitcake and jumped from one conclusion to the next. And when Peter would wander in half dead from work or from Spider-Man missions, but publicly from work, she honestly didn't give a darn and would go crying to Daddy. This was her character. But one character arrived on the scene on a blind date to change the history of Marvel. Mary Jane Watson, later Mary Jane Parker. And the truth is, she took the world by storm. With her line, "Face it, Tiger, you hit the jackpot." And the trouble is that a lot of people are of the view that either Captain America or Iron Man or whatever are the main characters of Marvel. They never were before maybe the year 2004. It was really House of M and Civil War, which serve as reboots for Marvel. They do. And they were, along with Avengers Disassembled, a series of storylines meant to revamp and reboot and reorganize the Marvel universe. So that, for example, Steve Rogers was now the lead. Spider-Man was some loser who looked up to him, which is laughable because Spider-Man didn't really have much to do with him previously. And honestly, Peter Parker was the sort of mature, wise young man who had outgrown the need for personal heroes. The only real hero he still had, to an extent, was Uncle Ben, who admittedly was great. And to an extent, maybe Seward Trainer when he arrived on the scene, as Seward himself was a fatherly sort of man. And Aunt Anna. But these are basically relatives of the Parkers. Two of them are basically uncles, one of them is basically an aunt. And I consider Seward a bit of an uncle because of how he treated Ben Reilly and how he took him in. So, really, you don't have personal heroes for Peter. He's a grown man. Men don't have that kind of relationship, really. You can kind of develop mentor and student relationships in life. You will. But to hero worship someone like you're a child and they're, I don't know, a half god, it's not exactly healthy in grown men. So, and the truth of the matter is, Peter is someone who, on the hero's journey, at that point in life, what he didn't need was another dad or another half god mentor to hero worship like he did in his youth. So, that's the simple nature of Spider-Man by the time of all those series of reboots. Although, arguably, the entirety of Marvel was rebooted to an extent in... Okay, you had Heroes Reborn, which was a reboot, but you also had 1997, when they got rid of Ben Reilly, and then shortly afterwards got rid of MJ so they could restart Spider-Man. Then they just wanted to restart it again in 1999. Then they decided to restart it essentially in 2000. Like, it just became a mess. But the one character they could not quite get rid of until One More Day was Mary Jane. But here's the interesting thing. When they started trying to tear Peter away from MJ, all of Marvel suffered for it, and it lost its equilibrium. And the reason is that Mary Jane is simply the best-selling Marvel character of all times. And arguably, it was more the relationship between her and Peter that people bought the Spider-Man comics than anything else. Actually, go back and check the 1960s, 70s, and 80s Spider-Man comics. They're not really action-adventure stories. They're rom-coms. Actually, even Goblins at the Gate, one of my favorite stories, is less about Peter / Spider-Man and more about Mary Jane. Because she's got an acting gig. She's trying to get it, and Roderick Kingsley is not wanting to pay and is basically trying to go after her. Hobgoblin functions more as a menace to MJ, with Peter there to protect her and save her. And the whole thing about taking down Hobgoblin is almost secondary to the relationship. And it's something very peculiar that happened after MJ arrived on the scene. She took over the comic book of Spider-Man. Anyone who says no is not read that era or deluding themselves. Let's just be honest. This is the simple truth.
Take off the rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah. Stan Lee once described the Spider-Man run, or at least the Spider-Man stories, as men or boys' soap opera. And that it was a soap opera for men or boys. Stan knew what he was doing. Stan was a brilliant writer. And arguably, he was a very talented one. Arguably, I find his best writing was not romance, though. But he himself described it with, as I said, soap opera. Soap operas, historically, are typically more romances. Stan the man knew what he was talking about when he said, yeah, this is what my stories are with Spider-Man. This is what Spider-Man is. But what's really fascinating is that in the 90s, we got to see how Stan would have liked to have written Spider-Man had he not trapped himself with the romance genre. As he was one of the creative hands, according to the main showrunner of the Spider-Man cartoon that was on staff. Yes, Stan wrote some of the episodes and even had a very strong influence and impact on the cartoon. The Spider-Man 90s cartoon is more of a mystery, action, adventure, thriller series. It is very much a thriller in some ways. It is also a bit of a horror, techno horror of sorts. And so it's a very complex series. Yes, it has its romance that's centered at the core of the series, but the story is focused on Peter Parker, not Mary Jane. Whereas the comics were always more focused on MJ. Peter was secondary. Although, that said, arguably, the depiction of Peter that we see in the cartoon is actually got the personality of Ben Reilly, not Peter Parker. Peter Parker himself is someone who's clinically depressed half the time and is only ever able to behave in a cheerful or happy manner when MJ's around. Whereas Ben is the optimist saying, well, I've got a fridge stocked full of food and I've got a TV waiting for me at home. And I'm Spider-Man. Even though the mantle's cursed, I've got all that going for me. Okay. And in the cartoon, Peter sometimes says, you know what? My costume's torn. I've missed so many dates, but I'm Spider-Man. I wouldn't change that for the world. That is Ben Reilly, not Peter Parker. And I can say this because I've read enough Spider-Man comics, Dan's read enough Spider-Man comics, and we've become fairly familiar with the character over the course of many, many years. Peter is a cynic and a pessimist. Ben is an optimist. But here's the thing. This is also why Ben Reilly was so important to Peter Parker. Why the two serve a very, very key function in the story for one another. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, MJ assuming the role of central character in Marvel transformed it arguably from a weird position in the comic book history to what is effectively American Show Joe. That is to say, more romantic-centered story than, let's say, DC, which serves more as a kind of shonen story. And these are rough comparisons. This is not exact. Bear in mind, there are action stories over in Marvel, and there are stories in DC that are more romantically centered. But, all that aside, there's also the archetype. Arguably, Mary Jane is the Queen of Love archetype. With, as Queen of Love, MJ has people paying homage to her in universe, in some capacity. Yes, she's a big damsel. No, let's be honest, she is a damsel. But in her case, it's a case where you have the likes of Ben Reilly, who pays homage to her when he's playing the role of Gawain, because he's archetypally the Maiden's Knight, because he has a bunch of love interest, and he also is out always seemingly saving one lady or another, defending their honor. But he ultimately pays homage to MJ, such as in the Judas Traveler attacking MJ story. You've got even the likes of Captain America, who has paid homage to her, Iron Man. At some point, the characters meet her, speak well of her. Yes, occasionally they have to save her, or help Spider-Man save her, but they pay homage to her. It is her favor and grace that they seek. This is ultimately a chivalric ideal and tradition in terms of literature. But, well, actually, to an extent, it's always only ever been Spider-Man and Spider-Man, that is to say, Ben and Peter, who save her. And yes, I'm calling Ben Spider-Man as he was Spider-Man back in the day. And so, she's kind of been cast in a much larger role in Marvel than Lois Lane is over in DC. She's also, of course, the lover archetype, as is Peter. Peter is arguably not the warrior, nor is he really a king archetype, nor is he the magician. He is the lover in his fullness. Same with her. Arguably, Ben Reilly would be more the warrior archetype. But there is another set of archetypes for Peter and Ben during the Clone Saga, at least. And that is the twins. They are the warrior twins in Castor and Pollux. This is mold. And what this means is, well, they come as a pair. But on the other hand, means archetypally Ben never had a shot with MJ. And the thing is, it is not arguably thematically Peter's permission you need to become Spider-Man. It's MJ's. She's the main character. She's the center of the Spider mythos. And Miles has not gotten that. Yes, I'm going to mention that because Miles Morales is Miles Morales. He's not Spider-Man. Peter Parker is Spider-Man. You must be Peter Parker to be Spider-Man. And the only two characters to ever bear that name are Peter Parker and Ben Reilly. They are both Peter Parker. And Peter Parker is not a mantle. That's a name. That is who these two are. And the truth of the matter is that I don't think for the fans there's ever been any other option than these two. And it's probably because they're the only two that were clearly designed with the goal of pleasing the fans and catering to them, with the key difference between the two being that Peter Parker stories center around Mary Jane and are romance stories. That's all they are. Whereas the Ben Reilly stories are techno thriller horror with some mystery thrown in and the occasional action story. Now, as to MJ and Peter's relationship, why it's the core of the Marvel Universe, there is no other relationship like it. The Cyclops Jean Grey relationship, such as it is, was always a joke. Jean wanted Wolverine. She never really wanted Cyclops. She never even really liked him that way.
You didn't need Grant Morrison to break them up.
No, the two were basically all but broken up by the time of Inferno, for all intents and purposes. She didn't like that he got married, and he didn't like that she was not Madeline Pryor. And honestly, Jean Grey, the minute Wolverine came in, it's clear she was basically meant for Wolvie. The problem is she did not have the backbone to actually take the great leap forward in her heroine's journey and go for the man she loves. Logan did not have the courage and the backbone to take his hero's journey all the way and actually be with the woman he loved. As for Cyclops, he went for Maddie, then abandoned her, which shows him to be a bit of a cad. Well, more than a little. The thing is, archetypally, Jean is, alongside Cyclops and even Wolverine, three characters who are a failed set of lover archetypes. They're failures. They could not do what MJ and Peter could do. And they're meant to be compared with and found wanting in comparison to the Parkers. Then we've got the Fantastic Four. Susan runs off with Namor or whomever, such as T'Challa, whenever the mood strikes her. So she's clearly the hedonistic lover archetype. Reed Richards is more the magician archetype. He represents a Peter Parker who's obsessed with his toys and gizmos and pays no mind to the rest of the world. Or who's closer to Johnny. Johnny and Ben Grimm represent failed versions of Ben Reilly, with Johnny being someone who, rather than defending the virtue and honor of maidens, takes advantage of them. Ben Grimm represents a whiny, weak-willed, sulky version of Ben Riley who is unable to properly keep the family together and bring everyone together, like how Ben was able to do for Peter and MJ, as it was Ben who helped save their marriage when it was at its worst and lowest point. And in turn, MJ and Peter were able to restore Ben to what he was meant to be. That is to say, Peter Parker. He became, well, bear in mind, Ben started off a bit of a shadow to Peter, but then he grew into being his equal and his twin. This is thanks to Peter and MJ. In turn, Peter and MJ were headed towards being shadow archetypes, and Ben restored them to the light. But with Ben Grimm, Susan Richards, and Reed Richards, it's a total inversion of that. And so they've failed their hero's journey. As for Janet and Hank Pym,
This is, Mary Jane was successful enterprise and Peter was the scientist. The difference here is that Janet pretty much demeaned her husband. Yes, what Hank Pym did wasn't right.
oh yeah,
But she demeaned him to the point where he was emotionally at his lowest.
well, she mostly did that after they're divorced, didn't she? Like always just harping on about how he hit her. Honestly, eventually in the comics, she harped on it to such an extent after the reboots that you can't really fully blame the guy.
She,
No, I just mean with how she's always saying, "Well, he hit me, he hit me." Yeah, Janet, it's been years, and he went to prison for that. Like, what do you want?
even before then, she
Okay.
harped on him upon other stuff.
Okay, well,
And to the point, and him not having a
Well,
successful
he-
science career.
yeah, and he went pretty psycho though. Like, just to defend her, he went pretty psycho. So, yeah, he had no right to hit her. But after the fact, after you went to prison for it, it's like, okay, the dude's paid for his crime. And I do think it was a crime, and he did go to jail, and he should have gone to jail, and he deserved everything that he got. And, like, harping on and on about it for, like, a year is like, okay, sure, he deserves it. But then when you're harping on about it, and that's your entire character, yeah, okay, whatever. Not that I sympathize with him. He's trash. I'm just saying. But then we get the relationship of Rogue and Remy. There again, it's a shadow inversion to MJ and Peter. Now, the guilt over the Morlocks massacre is comparable to the guilt that Peter feels for stealing the last moments with Aunt May from Ben, or the guilt about possibly being the clone, which later, yeah. But the difference in these two storylines in the 90s is that Peter and MJ are able to overcome it and come together because they love each other. Rogue and Remy, she ditches him in Antarctica to perish, and he goes full apocalypse, Four Horsemen. So they are not able to make the relationship work. They are not able to overcome their guilt and grief for hurting each other. And they're not able to get over being spiteful towards one another. Like MJ and Peter were able to basically instantly forgive each other every little trespass. And that is really the core there. No one has a relationship like MJ and Peter in Marvel. Ever. Like, and it's interesting that, for example, Tony Stark wanted that kind of relationship with Rumiko Fujikawa, but she had a bad case of dying, so that didn't happen. She also could be a little spiteful at times, even against him. I mean, still misfortune rubbing it in his face. That was, and as well as cheating on him at one point. But on the other hand, he cheated on her with a sorority. So, not exactly showing themselves to be positive archetypal figures there. But on the other hand, they did overcome that. But still, they're they're nothing compared to the real OG Marvel couple. So
And we're not gonna start talking about Pepper Potts.
no, and especially with her and Happy Hogan. Oh dear heavens, she ruined that man. That said, the other X-Men, are there any other X-Men? I'm joking. I'm joking. There's none of any real relevance.
Like even Lorna and Alex.
Okay, I like those two, but they got a wrecking ball thrown at them in after 2003, I believe, which was just a little funny and a little dumb. But the truth of the matter is, if there is any center of the universe to Marvel, it is Mary Jane. Because Spider-Man would not have continued being Spider-Man if it was not for her. Spider-Man would not have continued being a superhero were it not for Mary Jane. And the stories revolving around her have her as the Queen of Love, that is to say, her all but holding court, and people paying homage to her, seeking out her advice, be they Ben Reilly. You've got X-Men, you've got Fantastic Four members, you've got Power Packs, parents. Everybody seeks out MJ. Everybody basically wants her advice. Everybody wants to be near her. She is the Queen of Love. She is Guinevere holding court. She is. And so everybody has to pay homage. And arguably, you have Peter, who's her lover, and Peter himself, with his adherence to the idea of, with great power, there must always come great responsibility, is basically a knight holding true to the ideal of King Arthur, let's say. Basically, he's holding true to the ideal. And the thing is, MJ holds him to that ideal. And MJ embodies the ideal in a way because she has a lot of power as someone who's wealthy, who's a successful model and actress and a millionaire, and who has also power over those around her in her life, archetypally. And so she takes that and bears the responsibility well and realizes how much of a responsibility and duty she has to those around her. And she holds Peter accountable and even Ben accountable for their burdens and responsibilities. They have an obligation. She refuses to accept any kind of failure to uphold their obligations. And this is important because she holds them to the highest ideal, so they have to live up to that. As for Peter, more than any rescue of MJ, what he has to do to earn the position of lover of MJ is and this is the thing, this is what all the stories from 1975 in particular, from when Gwen Stacy passes away up to the marriage, this is what the story's all about. Peter has to earn his place by her side. He has to basically prove himself worthy of his wife. He has to prove himself worthy of being her husband. And arguably, this is what the whole ideal archetypally in the hero's journey is for men. Like, for example, the man must go and slay the dragon in order to earn the lady. And the lady's journey in this, let's say, take Sleeping Beauty, for example, is to be rescued. But she is to hold herself to such an ideal, and the prize being her, but she is to hold the man accountable and say, in order to become worthy of me, to wed me, you must prove yourself. You have to kill the dragon. And this is the whole ideal behind men and women's relationship. The man must earn the lady, but the lady cannot bestow her favor to just anyone. She bestows it to her chosen knight, who slays the dragon. So MJ kind of does this with Peter. Although, arguably, the dragon, I guess, would be the various villains. And except Peter does not slay them, rather he imprisons them. And Peter ends up, of course, having to go out and fight crime, only to come back to her side. There's a reason a lot of Spider-Man stories back in the day ended with Peter basically going back home to her. And there was more panel time given to the romances, such as, well, when MJ offers to help him up for the day in a way that's better than her fetching him coffee, which is a pretty funny scene. But ultimately, this is the most important relationship in Marvel. And that's all that Marvel's story boils down to. DC Comics might be about the various founding Justice Leaguers and their families, with the notion of family being the bedrock of the story to some extent, sort of, although DC Comics never liked advancing the story of the families, which is pretty dumb. But ultimately, DC Comics has it. Basically, you have the Green Lantern mythos that has its story about overcoming fear and revolves around adventures in space. And the rest of DC basically revolves around either Superman or, to an extent, Batman. But in truth, Marvel only ever had one story: MJ and Peter. Although they did try to go away from it with Ben Reilly, which was great. But ultimately, they balked and backtracked, and then decided to just dump the whole thing because they were angry and childish. And they were led by one pathetic excuse for a loser, aka Quesada.
And it's kind of an irritation that every other hero and title have to find some way to connect itself to Spider-Man and Mary Jane.
Well, yeah, but
like Wolverine being Spider-Man's goduncle, godfather.
Or something, yeah. And you have, of course, Jean Grey, who has to be friends with MJ and has to have modeled with her.
You have Speedball, his mother, being a co-actress with her.
Yep. And you have Reed Richards, who is basically big bro to Johnny Storm, who is a frenemy of sorts with Spider-Man, because half the time he's a rival of his, the other half he's friendly. But typically he's just a hot-headed buffoon who annoys Spider-Man.
You have Daredevil, that is essentially a brother.
Yeah, he's a bit of a bro to Spider-Man. And you have, of course, Luke Cage, who's basically Spider-Man's fanboy and bro. But you have, in turn, Danny Rand, who's also his fanboy and his bro. You have, well, then again, you have Tony Stark, who's a Spider-Man fanboy originally. Yes, originally Iron Man was not a mentor. That's a stupid idea. He never mentored Spider-Man. He was never like one to Spider-Man. Actually, he followed Spider-Man around a bit like, oh wow, I was a terrible drunk. And you're like the perfect hero. What's your secret? And he basically hero worshipped Spider-Man.
Captain America was the same way.
Yeah, although he's kind of like, oh yeah, I really like Spider-Man. He's a great guy. He's incredible. But you have Spider-Man. Oh yeah, you're Captain America. Cool. But Spider-Man didn't really know Cap. I know people want him to have been a fanboy of Cap, but actually, the two didn't really know each other. Cap was more familiar with Spider-Man than vice versa. Cap was just some like, oh yeah, you fought in World War II. That was really cool. But I don't know you personally. I know you through Tony, who's friendly with you. And so this is like, okay, seriously. It's like 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. That's the whole Marvel universe. In order to connect someone to either one of the Parkers or Ben. That's the only way the universe functions.
Even Nick Fury is like, oh, Peter's parents were S.H.I.E.L.D. spies that
that was such a
convoluted thing.
yeah.
And then
I never liked that retcon because it's getting to be too much.
And then Nick Fury, whenever a case blows into his face, and they need an out for such a case, Spider-Man shows up.
Silver Sable herself is really good friends with MJ and is someone who crushed on Peter for a while, but she's also Nick Fury's goddaughter. Okay, so then you got Felicia Hardy, Peter's ex. Oh, well, we have to keep her in the story. How do we do that? She's now MJ's bestie, and she hero worships MJ like she's her big sister. This is pre-97, guys. It's just, okay, well, we've written the character out of the story. We have to write them back in and connect them to the Parkers again. It's just everything must connect to the Parkers.
It's like Power Pack. Oh, doesn't have anything to do with Spider-Man. Works with Fantastic Four, which works with MJ.
Yeah, or with Peter. And it's
or they work with Wolverine.
Yeah, who has a relationship of sorts. This is the thing. If you examine each of the Marvel relationships, you'll notice that they all connect to Spider-Man and, more importantly, Mary Jane Parker. And that's really the whole thing. And the idea is basically King Arthur's Knights of Swords. Like, Captain America is very relevant because he is essentially, I don't know, like, he's essentially maybe one of the extra knights of the round paying homage to Queen Guinevere. That is to say, MJ. Tony is a knight. He's paying homage to MJ. It is really about MJ here. Or, to an extent, they're paying homage to Peter as the chief knight of the code, which is that with great power there must always come great responsibility. Or they pay homage to Ben when he comes into the story, because when he comes into the story, he's the Gawain. He is the chief knight of that ideal. And so you've got a story that is, in a way, wrapped around the ideal of there must always come great responsibility. And every character wants to, in some degree or other, live up to this ideal. Now, some, like Cap and Iron Man, I will give them credit, do a better job than other heroes do. Now, like I said, I was harsh on Steve earlier, but it's just, he's irrelevant to the Spider-Man mythos to a large extent. So he's actually more like a secondary character in Marvel because of that. But he does represent an ideal because he has a secondary ideal, which is very important to Americans. That's truth, justice, and the American way. Very important. Which, arguably, truth, justice, and the American way is actually more DC's chief value in idea, because DC revolves around that idea. If you're looking at it in terms of knights in the style of Arthuriana, DC, it's all about truth, justice, and the American way, I guess. Marvel, it's about with great power there must always come great responsibility. And the idea is that for Cap, he does mostly live up to the ideal. So he does a good job. He gets MJ and Peter's seal of approval, even though they don't really know him. Flash Thompson, to an extent, is more important in the Marvel universe than Cap, weirdly enough, because Flash was Peter's best friend for a long time. So it's like the characters are, in a way, archetypally only relevant to Marvel if they're appearing with Spider-Man. And let's be honest, the Spider titles sold better than any other for the longest time with Marvel. And the reason for that is that people were only interested, really, in Spider-Man and, I guess, X-Men. But even X-Men are secondary in terms of the story to Spider-Man. And we've been going on forever. So tell us what you all think in the comments section down below. And in particular, we'd like to hear about how strongly you feel about how MJ lies at the center of it all, followed by, of course, Peter and Ben in that order. And don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were, I guess, Peter and MJ wanting to smash each other.